One of the things that defines a battle anime is its power system and the techniques characters go on to reveal to turn the tides of those battles. We've talked at length about the narrative aspects of Yu Yu Hakusho, but now I want to slow it down a bit and talk about the techniques we've seen on display and go over what the 10 best abilities in the series are. Now, I'm very purposefully using the term best and not strongest, because I think ranking them based on power isn't fair or interesting considering how the show scales in the latter half of the series. We're going to be keeping a few criteria in mind when it comes to placement. Power, which is a catch-all term for a technique's overall strength and not just can it one-shot an opponent. Versatility, so how well can the technique be adapted to fit more than one scenario. Potential, so just how much does the technique turn the tides of battle. And drawbacks, so is there any real downside or danger to using the technique. All these criteria are going to work together to inform my overall opinion and where the techniques land on this list, so I'm going to try to do my best to help you understand why something may be higher or lower than you feel it should be. At the same time, I'm going to be aggregating everything we know about each technique to look at the implications of the power itself, both in and out of context of the show. So I won't necessarily be framing this from the perspective of the characters in the show, more so from the perspective of how well would these techniques serve you if you were able to use them in that universe. Cool? Cool. Before we dive in though, I'd like to once again give a shout out to the wonderful people behind Symphonic Anime, an event celebrating the music that enhances plenty of our favorite shows like Attack on Titan, Naruto, My Hero Academia, and more. Several composers from the anime world will also be in attendance too, which is pretty rad. The concert is just a few short weeks away, so if you're in the vicinity of any of the upcoming shows, definitely head to the links below and grab your tickets. Experiencing music from pop culture, whether that's anime or video games, in a live orchestral setting like this is definitely something you should do, so I hope you get to, and thanks again to Symphonic Anime for reaching out.
Shards of Winter!
Kicking things off in the 10th place slot, we have Toya's Shards of Winter. There are a few reasons I think this technique is so good, but the biggest thing is how well it works as a ranged option in combat. Being able to handle yourself when you're in striking range is important, but you also need something to keep you engaged if your enemy is able to put and keep distance between you. We've seen that Shards of Winter is not only fast, but has a fairly quick casting time, while also packing a punch. As we saw, the shards are moving with enough velocity and have the sharpness to effortlessly pierce skin with the intention of shredding internal organs. Considering the strength of the technique also scales with the growth of the wielder, it will remain relevant and effective, as evidenced from the fact it was useful in both tournaments Toya competed in. Not only that, but if the attack proves to be too much for the enemy, they'll have a difficult time closing the distance between you two, and the technique itself doesn't seem as though it consumes much in the way of energy based on just how frequently Toya used it. If I had to point out a drawback, it would be that once the enemy does manage to close the distance, the technique becomes far less useful since there'd be little time to cast it. A faster enemy could also avoid the shards altogether, and a durable opponent might be completely unfazed by them. All of these things together cement it in the 10th place spot.
Tornado Fist's the name!
Next up we have Jin's Tornado Fist technique, a destructive display of physical and elemental forces at play. We've seen how easily a blow from this attack can destroy the environment upon contact, so we can imagine the way it would wreck a body if a direct strike is made. What's even crazier about the attack is that even if your opponent manages to avoid getting clobbered, the strength of the vortex passing them by is still strong enough to send them flying like a kite in a hurricane. Couple that with the fact that the swirling wind can also be used to deflect attacks, and you've got yourself a strong mixture of offense and defense. Oh, and let's not forget, you can use a double Tornado Fist technique. Admittedly though, the Tornado Fist isn't all that versatile, and even worse, it takes a bit of setup time to get the vortex going in the first place, which a savvy enough enemy would exploit to prevent. There's also the inherent danger of someone having the same idea as Yusuke and firing energy directly into the vortex, which would spell bad news if you don't notice their intention quickly enough. However, the power this technique packs, as well as the fact that it also can serve a defensive purpose, just barely edge out Shards of Winter. I honestly went back and forth in my head about the placement of these two, but this is how we landed.
I know exactly where to cut you with my psychic scalpel to cause pain.
Taking the 8th spot, we have Dr. Kamiya's Spirit Scalpel that's capable of not just harming others, but also repairing even something as insane as a lost limb. What makes the Spirit Scalpel so insane is the immense precision to which it can be utilized. It's more than capable of simply slicing and dicing anyone in its way, but can also be honed in such a way that it can effortlessly cause internal damage without any external evidence, destroying organs or even leaving someone completely paralyzed. Beyond that, the ability to heal damage done to your body mid-combat is such a massive advantage and can turn any battle into a genuine war of attrition. The degree to which one could put this to use is almost endless if you know what you're doing. But that brings us to the downsides of the Spirit Scalpel. You do need to know what you're doing to genuinely get the most out of this technique. In the hands of someone like Kamiya, it's basically a weapon of mass destruction. In the hands of any old rando like you or me, we would need to take the time to study up on anatomy, and even then, if you're up against demons, you would need to hope your knowledge carries over to some degree between the two different species. And with as helpful as healing can certainly be, as we saw in the series, it does require some uninterrupted time to reattach a lost limb, which a smart enemy will not give you. Despite the learning curve required for the standard wielder, the Spirit Scalpel's nearly endless versatility and potential skyrocketed it up to this spot. Next up we have Karasu's Explosive Touch, though right off the bat that is a misleading name since it was made known that he doesn't even have to touch you to ruin your day, which by itself is a massive advantage. Setting aside how disgustingly strong it is to be able to summon explosives strong enough to mutilate your enemy, this technique comes with the added bonus that if your enemy is not a powerful enough person, they won't even be able to see what's happening to them. That adds an entire layer of psychological terrorism by way of fear, which can cause panic and lead to mistakes. Just ask Midorengia. Hell, even being able to see the bombs doesn't necessarily guarantee your safety. Ask Karama. The versatility of this technique is a massive part of its overall strength. Being able to not just detonate bombs directly inside of your opponent, but being able to set up entire minefields with no way out. This is what gives the technique all of its potential and advantages. Whether the bombs are visible or not, you're probably getting cooked or doing the cooking. The Spirit Gun is such an interesting case in terms of just how much power it packs, but also the sheer versatility of the technique. Now, when I say Spirit Gun, I'm also including other ways we've seen it used, like the shotgun, as well as techniques that mirror the Spirit Gun, but in a more controlled way like Kazemaru's Blast, which was directly compared to the Spirit Gun. After all, the Spirit Gun is nothing more than a focused discharge of one's own spirit energy. While Yusuke never quite took it to the levels of others and kept it as just a bullet firing technique, in the hands of a capable person with study and practice, the Spirit Gun opens the door for so many iterations. As we saw in the first fight with Hiei, the battle with Chu, Bakken, etc., the Spirit Gun is versatile enough to flip a situation on its head with enough thought. With thought and application, you can easily adapt to the situation at hand. However, the Spirit Gun's biggest drawback is its charge time. Sure, you could fire off a decently powerful shot without much effort, but a truly remarkable shot takes time to build, and that kind of time leaves you a sitting duck. The Spirit Gun's raw power and versatility landed at number 6, but I couldn't quite justify pushing it further up the list despite being so iconic. It rounds out the bottom 5, which is perfectly alright.
Dragon! The darkness flame!
I know it's going to irritate some people to see the Darkness Flame didn't make the top 3, but just hear me out. No one is arguing that the Darkness Flame's raw power output is absolutely insane. A wave of sentient hellfire that can reduce your opponent to little more than a charged smudge on the wall is terrifying. It's very much an instant win button if everything goes exactly the way you need it to, and that's where it runs into some issues. The biggest issue being that of control. As I just mentioned, the Darkness Flame itself is a sentient creature that essentially needs to be lured out of the depths with bait and then directed at the opponent. But there are a number of things that can go wrong here. You have to use your own energy as bait, and there's a decent chance that if the dragon comes, it'll take the hook with the bait. On top of that, as Hiei said, once the dragon is let loose, you don't really have a say in the matter, especially if you haven't mastered the dragon, which I'm going to assume the hypothetical you in this scenario hasn't, since it's something Hiei struggled with even with the added buff of the Jagan Eye. Even if you do successfully pull off the technique and the hook isn't swallowed with the bait, you've essentially crippled the arm you used to summon the dragon, and that's the best case scenario. The fact of the matter is that the sheer unadulterated power of the Darkness Flame is just as likely to incinerate your opponent as it is to become an uncontrolled, unmitigated disaster. There's also the fact that if this is your trump card and you do manage to launch it without issue, a strong enough opponent could still end up redirecting it, destroying it, or being so unbothered by it that they use it as transportation. So even though I love this technique and it's genuinely the kind of attack that could strike fear in the hearts of your enemies, the sheer danger associated with using it in its unmastered state is just way too high. That's what keeps it from being higher on this list regardless of how good it is otherwise.
Splinter! Ryusuke!
At number 4, we land on the Splinter Ryusuke, which is like a specialized distillation of what I said about the Spirit Gun, which is why it edges it out despite being a bit less versatile. It's representative of what the Spirit Gun could become with the right amount of effort and a clear goal in mind. The Splinter Ryusuke may lack the raw destructive power of the standard Spirit Gun, but it more than makes up for that with the fact it's designed to help the individual take on multiple enemies simultaneously. By splintering the orb of spirit energy into smaller ones, you vastly increase the area you can cover, but what makes the technique so damn powerful is the fact fact the spirit orbs themselves have a homing capability to them. This by itself would make a crowd think twice, but when you keep the tracking in mind, you realize just how much more lethal it can be when aimed at a single opponent, as we saw with Yusuke. Having one ability that is just as effective against a group as well as an individual is genuinely insane. The charge time isn't even all that slow either, with the biggest window of opportunity for something to go wrong being the windup for the kick that splits the initial orb into small shots. It's unclear if doing this divides the power of the initial attack equally among the splinters, but even if it does, if you get pelted by enough of them quickly enough, it won't matter. It's just a flat out better version of the shotgun technique. Now before we get into the top 3, there were a few honorable mentions I wanted to bring up. Seen in the battle between Onji and Kuwabara, this technique may not come across as anything special, but consider what it does. When trapped inside, the wielder can expel the target from not just the immediate vicinity, but from the dimension entirely. Where you could end up is anyone's guess. It seems less effective because Kuwabara got exceedingly lucky and happened to just be ejected out at the previous stadium, but I'm sure in the absence of plot armor, that would have been the end of him in the home dimension. Despite being incredibly strong from an ability standpoint, the true drawback comes in the form of information and luck. First, if your enemy has seen the technique even a single time, you're going to have a much tougher time actually capturing them. Second, even if your enemy is unaware of what the technique does, most people have the self-preservation skills to avoid an ominous orb of black energy coming at them. The technique is fantastic, but only if you have the element of surprise or get lucky. Put on display during the battle between Kurama and Gamma, the makeup of chains is a fantastic trapping ability that requires little in the way of setup and more in the way of precision. Being able to slow down your opponent by locking them in place with excessive weight that can't be shed of their own will is wonderful for minimizing threats for not just you, but your teammates. The downside here comes from the fact that you do need to be as fast as or faster than your opponent to catch them, if even just one time. Even more so if the enemy is aware of what you can do. There's also the fact that a strong enough enemy won't be hindered at all by the added weight, which wouldn't be ideal. Lastly, the paint used requires the user's blood to be mixed in, so at any given time you likely only have a finite amount of that on hand, with the last resort being using your own blood directly. But if you're to the point where you need to resort to that, you're probably already cooked. Even still, the sheer defensive utility of this technique and how quickly it can overwhelm enemies is not to be understated. Our final honorable mention is Game Master's Arcade. Amanuma's territory is insanely powerful when used with the proper precautions in mind. The rules of the territory are the rules of the game and vice versa. Though for the most part, the ability itself isn't the best for combat, but with the right wielder and the right skill set, it can be nearly unstoppable. Keeping in mind that the territory can't be deactivated until the wielder dies or the game is complete, it's perfect for stalling for time. Though, again, under the right circumstances with the right game being manifested, it could quite easily kill your enemies. However, the thing that truly holds Arcade back is just how dangerous it also is for the user. Without a proper understanding of the mechanics, you could inadvertently put yourself in the same position as Amanuma, where the rules of the game you chose dictate your demise if you're defeated. In careful hands, Arcade could be absolutely devastating, but its built-in danger does keep it out of the top 10. With those honorable mentions out of the way, we can finally dive into the top 3. If you made it this far, consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It helps the algorithm show some love to small channels like mine. Leave a comment below to see if you can guess what the top 3 are. And while you're doing so, let's go ahead and dive on in.
For your education, my son, the demonic absorption wall.
Claiming the bronze medal is Yomi's Demon Absorption Wall. What an absolutely incredible defensive technique to have just tucked away in your back pocket. A sphere of protective energy that keeps you completely safe from all of your opponent's ranged attacks so long as they consist of demon energy. Considering where this technique is first put on display, that's so busted that it's actually unfair. It may lack in versatility and have no offensive capabilities, but rendering an opponent's energy attacks completely ineffective cannot be understated here. You've cut off an entire combat option, and if your enemy doesn't realize what's happening fast enough, the Demon Absorption Wall can also cause them to burn through much more energy than they should. Not needing to manifest the wall in any particular direction because of its enveloping nature leaves little in the way of weaknesses to be exploited. However, the significant drawback here is that it only fends off and absorbs demon energy, so spirit energy is still free to pass right through. It does force you into a weird spot where this is only useful in certain areas or circumstances, but that doesn't necessarily negate just how good this technique is. Hell, think of just how much of the Dark Tournament this technique would have trivialized. It's insane, and that usefulness is why it's earned the number 3 slot.
Only your words have power here. Just make sure you follow my one posted rule.
To be honest, I went back and forth with whether to give this the number 1 slot or not, but ultimately decided the silver medal was perfectly reasonable. Kaito's territory is so disgustingly strong in the right hands that I genuinely cannot believe we only got to see it in action one time. Just think about the rules of the territory itself. You're at the mercy of the taboo word in play, which we've seen can be turned into a time game that gets tougher and tougher, so the rule of taboo itself is flexible enough for a creative mind to craft a game that the opponent has no hope of winning. Especially when you remember that it isn't even the words themselves that are being made taboo, it's the arrangement of letters or sounds in a particular order. On top of that, the territory itself has a baked-in rule that prohibits violence, shielding you with an impenetrable barrier that laughs in the face of raw power, so your enemy is quite literally forced to participate in the game and has no choice but to follow the rules to win. Taboo can be used to simply stall or be made more active to capture souls too. You're pretty much screwed once you enter the territory unless you decide to just give up and leave. To make matters worse, you'd have a nearly impossible time trying to get the drop on the person utilizing the territory, since it can be active well before you arrive and has a 10-meter radius in terms of range with the territory's owner at the center point. The literal only downside to this territory is that the owner must also abide by the rules, so they also can't speak the taboo. And if you're unfortunate enough to face off with someone of high intelligence, you could end up losing at your own game. But for the most part, this territory is airtight in terms of how easily it could secure victory or deter enemies from even engaging, especially since using territories doesn't appear to be draining on the user at all. All of this combined is why the territory of taboo snagged the second place slot.
The Prism of Seven!
Now, the best technique in Yu Yu Hakusho is far and away Suzaku's Prism of Seven for quite a few reasons. The first being the namesake of the technique, where you create exact copies of yourself until there are a total of 7. This on its own already changes the dynamic of any fight, but what's even wilder is that there's no drop off in power or consequences for multiplying the way there is in something like Dragon Ball Z. Each of the clones mirrors the level of strength of the original, so there's literally no reason to refrain from using the technique. But where this technique really bears its fangs in conjunction with the sustained power levels is the fact that since they're your clones, they're all capable of pulling off your techniques flawlessly. So now your enemy not only has to worry about 7 versions of you all acting independently, but being overwhelmed by a cascade of whatever techniques you have up your sleeve. Like, combine Prism of 7 with most of the other techniques in this video and you've basically just committed a hate crime. It gets even crazier though, because just the act of using Prism of 7 has opened the door for you to use your own clones to heal yourself if you've taken sustained damage by reabsorbing them into yourself. And because you've restored your vitality, guess what? You can just reactivate Prism of 7. This technique is so goddamn strong, gives such a massive advantage in terms of number and force, and offers so much versatility thanks to the clones being able to act on their own while also offering an option for restoration, that it genuinely blows my mind that it has no true discernible weaknesses or obvious downsides. The biggest downside that I can see is that it does have a bit of a windup, so it takes some time to fully summon all 6 clones. A cautious enemy wouldn't give you the time to fully commit to the technique, but it also wasn't made clear if the clones would disappear if you're interrupted before they're all summoned. So even then, we can't even be sure if the casting time is a drawback. If your only downside is, oh, it just takes a few moments to get it going, when measured against the crazy advantages you gain, you've probably got a build that's going to get nerfed to shit in the same fashion as Rivers of Blood and Elden Ring. And that's why Suzaku's Prism of 7 takes the #1 slot on this list. It's absurd. And that rounds out our list. What techniques did I miss, or what would you have placed on this list instead? Let me know in the comments below. I'll be posting the inverse of this list soon, where we'll be taking a look at the top 10 worst techniques in the series, so make sure you're subscribed for when that one goes live in the near future. A huge shout out to these wonderful people for their continued support over on Patreon. If you'd like to see videos early, have suggestions for content, want to occasionally appear in videos, and of course snag a spot in the credit scroll, please consider heading over to the Patreon page. I do still want to get to a point where I can do this full time, because I'd love to put out content more frequently and not have to worry about splitting my attention. So if you can, give it a glance. If you can't, leaving comments, likes, and subscribing definitely helps too. Remember to take care of yourselves and others. I'll see you again soon, and as always, thanks for watching.